Today I'm going to be showing you how to recreate this smoke effect in Blender without the use of volumetrics, so it's really going to cut down your render times. So if you're running Blender on a potato, you're going to have no trouble rendering it out. It loops seamlessly as well, so that's great. So very easy to work with. If you want to loop the footage or use it as VJ content, that's great too. You can render it out with transparency, so if you want to start using it in your comps, say in like After Effects or something, layering the smoke over some like a fire scene or something like that, it's going to look great. And I can't wait to show you guys. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's get on with the tutorial. So once you've got Blender open, first thing we're going to do is just delete that default cube. So hit X and delete. I'm going to delete that light as well. We don't need that. So just delete that light. I'm going to hit Shift A, add a mesh, and we're going to add an icosphere. Now click on your icosphere and just hit Control 2. That's going to add a subdivision surface modifier, which just gives us more geometry on the object, essentially smoothing it out. Next step, you just need to hit Shade Smooth on the objects, just so that we get rid of those hard edges. Now I want you to hit S and then 8, so we scale this sphere up. We're going to grab our camera here and just Alt-G to reset the location, and then Alt-R to reset the rotation. And if you click over here, you can toggle on X-ray mode, so now you can see your camera inside the sphere. So yeah, that just toggles that. So I'm going to keep it on for now. I'm going to click on my camera. I'm just going to hit G and then Z. I'm just going to bring it up to the top here, just where it starts. And if you hit 0, you can actually go into camera mode, and we've basically got this camera set up inside this sphere. So now that that's done, let's start shading the scene. So you want to go into rendered mode, so hit Z and then 8. That takes you into rendered mode where we can start using a combination of shading and lighting to essentially build this smoke setup. Drag that in, so you create a new window. We're going to go over to this thing here, change that to shader editor. Now I'm going to hit N on the keyboard just to get rid of that menu. We don't need that. Now we're going to go to our world settings as well here. Now the first thing that I like to do is make the world black. So I'm going to drag that value down to black, so there's no light interacting with anything. Now I'm going to click on this sphere and I'm going to go to New Material over here. It's worth noting you can also edit the material here where this little red sphere is. This is pretty much the same as what you see here. They're just two different ways of working. I prefer to work in here just because you get a lot more control over what you can do. This menu is a little bit restricted. We're going to be working in here. So if you select your principal BSDF shader, first thing to notice about smoke is it's obviously transparent. Sort of like you can sort of see through it. It's got depth to it, do you know what I mean? So we're going to make this material transparent too. So we're going to be using this shader, but we're going to be combining it with a transparent shader. So we're getting sort of hints of this mixed with transparency. Shift A, shader, transparent BSDF. I'm going to pop that here, and we want to blend the two together. So the way you do that is you hit Shift A, add a mixed shader, and you're going to pop this here, and then you're going to plug this transparent into the other input. And now you basically can blend in between the two. You can't actually see this doing anything right now. That's just because we're using the Eevee render engine, and Eevee is a bit funny. You actually need to select another option on the material. So if you go over to this menu here and just scroll down, you'll see we have these settings here. We got all these different blend options. The two I normally use when working with transparency are alpha hashed and alpha blend. In this case, we're going to be using alpha blend just because it works a bit better with what we're trying to achieve. I'm going to get rid of the X-ray mode. And if I select alpha hashed, you'll see what I mean now. This thing's become see-through. So when I start pumping this FAC basically controls the blend between the two. This one, we've got a principal BSDF shader, push that to 1, and we've got transparency. So how do we actually start making the smoke effect? Well, the first thing you need, Blender, is of course a light source. So we're going to hit Shift A and add a point light. We're just going to leave this in the center, and we're going to pump this up to we'll say about 100 for now, but we might play around with this later. So with that point light added, click on your sphere again. If I hit 0 and go into camera mode, you see as I start bringing the FAC in, you can see the lights now reflecting against the inside of the sphere. If I took that point light away, you'd see nothing. And now that I've got that point light on, we're getting something. But we still need to actually make the smoke, because at the moment it's just a light inside a sphere. There's not really much detail. What we're going to do is use a noise texture and feed it into the FAC of the mix shader. So we're going to hit Shift A, add a noise texture, plug the FAC into the FAC, and we're going to pump the detail up 15. And just leave the roughness as it is. You can play around with this. The more rough, the more sort of gritty it looks, but it starts to look less like that, like smoke. Then if it's too rough, it ends up looking a bit more like a rust. We don't want it to be too rough. One thing I'd say as well is the reason we're getting this grittiness is because we're using the alpha hash blend mode. What I was saying about the different blend modes, they're just two ways of sort of calculating the transparency. Alpha hash sort of uses a noise-based calculation, whereas alpha blend will look a bit more smoother. They both have different use cases, really. Sometimes it's better to use alpha hash, but in our case, we're going to be using alpha blend. So you'll see we're getting a lot more smoky look now. What's really cool about this is you get a lot of control over the smoke. So back to our node setup, we're going to hit Shift A and we're just going to add a color ramp. And that's going to allow us to have greater control between the density of the smoke. If you pump this black value up, you're going to get more smoke. And then if you pump the white value up, you get finer detail and more gaps in your smoke. If you crunch them together, you get sort of dense smoke, but that's sort of a bit more chopped up. But I find as we're doing smoke, it's good to have a good sort of blend between the two. But you can play around with different types to get different kinds of smokes. There's a lot more fine tuning we can do, but I think first we should just animate this. It's really easy to animate this. So all you got to do is click on your noise texture. First of all, just make sure you got Node Wrangler installed. It's a Blender add-on, but it comes with Blender. It's not actually set up by default, but if you don't have it installed, all you got to do is go to Edit, Preferences, go to Add-ons, and you want to search Node Wrangler. Just make sure that's checked. That's all you got to do. What this does is it just makes working in here a lot easier. So now all I need to do is click on this noise texture, hit Control T. It's going to create these two nodes. That add-on is just a bit of a time saver. It just adds some shortcuts when working within here. So it automatically plugs the texture coordinate into the mapping nodes. You want to make sure it's generated. That's plugged into the vector. So that's fine. So yeah, leave it as that. And now what we can do is we can rotate this X value. We can rotate any of these values to create the smoke animation. So we're just keying a quick animation. I'm going to do it on the X. I think the X and the Y look the best, to be honest, but you can play around with this because a lot of it depends on where your camera is facing as well. So we'll just key in a quick animation. So first thing I want to do is go to the scene settings here and change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. Change the end frame to 300. So that makes it a 10-second animation. Now you want to click on the mapping coordinate here. And with your mouse hovered over the X-axis, we're going to hit I on the keyboard. That's going to add a keyframe on these three parameters. And with my mouse hovered over the timeline, I'm going to hold Shift and then hit the right arrow. Takes me to frame 300. Then I'm going to hit the right arrow again just to go to 301. And I'm going to change this to, let's see, I quite like it going up. You can basically, before you key it in, just have a look, just scrub through and have a look to see what direction it seems like the smoke's going. Because a lot of this depends on the position of your camera. I quite like it going up, so I'm just going to change this to 360 on the last frame. I'm going to add a keyframe again, so hit I on the keyboard with your mouse hovered over here. And that's going to create a keyframe. The reason why we put it to 301 is because if you set your keyframe to 300, you're going to render out a duplicate frame. So basically the first frame is going to be the exact same as the last frame. So when you try loop it, it's going to look like it's stuttering and it's not going to really look like it's looping. It will just make it look better if you give yourself an extra frame. So do that with your mouse hovered over the timeline again, hit A and then T, set the interpolation to linear. This makes sure that the animation doesn't accelerate and decelerate as it comes to the end. Make sure that it constantly keeps moving is what I'm trying to say. And now hit play and you can see we have this really cool smoke effect now. And now that we've got our animation going, let's look at some ways we can fine tune this. So you might want the smoke like that. That's kind of like a fast fire. That's sort of probably quite an aggressive fire. But if you want something a bit more subtle, you can drop this scale down on your noise texture, say to about 0.4. This is sort of more like a fog now. And so, yeah. And what you can do, you can just save loads of different variations of this. So I'm going to save this one now. So I'm going to save this one as Blender Fog. So I'll save that one as Blender Fog. And yeah, so that's one. Now you've got your animation set up. All you've got to do is just save multiple variations. And we'll call this Blender Fog V2. And we'll just make a few changes to these parameters, right? So this one, we've got this one. Let's try maybe bring this in a bit. This white value in. So you get loads of different kinds of smokes just by changing a few parameters as well. And the three main parameters you want to play around with are your scale, your roughness. You can play around with the distortion as well, which will sort of warp it a bit. I wouldn't go too crazy with that. Some more things you can play around with are the light intensity. If you pump that up, you're going to get a more washed out look. That's what you're going for. What you can also do is hit Shift A and you can actually add another light. So add another point light. You can make this one, say, like a yellow tinge. You can put this in different spots as well if you like. If you want to have like a gradient, so it looks like the fire is coming from like a specific place, you could do that. And you could also animate the power so it flickers if you want. That's something you could do as well. So for example, you could just add a keyframe here. You could go to the graph editor and you could go to the power. You could add an F-curve modifier over here, add modifier. You could add a noise modifier. Yeah, so you could add a noise modifier, and then this is basically you could make this flicker. You turn the strength up, sort of flickers the fire, if that makes sense. Maybe turn the strength down a little bit and make it a bit faster. And if you want that to loop, you would restrict your frame range over here. Set the start to 1 and the ends to 300, and you just blend them in and out. So set that to like, so this is how many frames it takes to blend in, and this is how many frames it takes to blend out. So yeah, that will make it loop perfectly. If you're going for that flicker effect, so we'll save that one as fog fire. We'll go back to this one, and there's some more things you can play around with as well. You can make it metallic. It might give you a little bit of a different look, and then you turn the specular. If you're doing that, you want to turn the roughness all the way up. If you are using the metallic shader, it'll just give your smoke a slight different look. So if you pump that light up again, then go to the icosphere, that'll give you a slight different look as well. Save that as fog 2. Then we'll do fog 3. We'll do smoke here. And then another thing you could try, select your camera, widen the focal length out. Gives you a different look as well. This sort of, because it's a wide angle, it sort of looks like sort of storm brewing. So we could call that smoke storm. Save that one. And then one more thing you could do as well is just rotate your camera a bit, right? So it's like that. We've literally just rotated the camera. Originally it was like that. Now we're just rotating it on the X a bit. So it looks like it is rising a bit more. And then you might want to play with the focal length, maybe push it in a bit more. Gives you sort of rising smoke effect. And then you can, again, play around with this. It's worth noting if you have the white value crunched up, you get more gaps in the smoke. So it sort of looks like it feathers out. Yeah, lots of different options, really. So just create a few, try out different things, render them out. They all loop perfectly. So you basically have loads of easy options that you can just render out, and then you can throw into After Effects and stuff like that and use in your comps. And they really work well. So, and remember, the black value gives it more density as well. So that looks really cool. Some more things you can do as well. You can go to your render properties. I don't think you really need to change the color settings for this, but if you want to, you can change these contrast settings. Say you want it a bit more high contrast, you can do that as well. And you can even pump the exposure up and play with the gamma settings as well. You want to really have a bit more control over your color. So yeah, with that done, all you got to do now is to render it out. So go to your output settings here. You just want to save it somewhere you can find it. So renders, and I'll just call this one. So yeah, just save it somewhere you can find it. You can set the file format to FFmpeg video. So encoding settings, MP4, H.264, and perceptually lossless output quality. So hit render and render animation, and you're done. And as you can see here, when we render this out, it renders so much faster than if you were doing this with volumetrics. See, look at that. It's going like 2 frames a second, honestly. This is so much quicker than if you're using volumetrics, or if you're using cycles, or even smoke simulations. This is gonna save you so much time. Super quick. 300 frames in less than a minute. So yeah, really good. So we got our final result, and you may notice there's a bit of banding that you're seeing. Because it's smoke, there's a very fine range between the gradients of the colors. So that's why you're getting that banding. It's because we've used H.264, which is obviously a compressed codec, and I don't think it's 16-bit color values either. So if you want to get like a perfect sort of looking smoke, you actually need to render it in a lossless codec. So, but I just wanted to show you the result now. That's why I went for H.264. For some people that would be fine enough, but if you want it to look really good, you probably want to use the QuickTime codec instead, and you want to use QT roll QT animation. And what I love about this design is you can render it out with transparency as well, and it looks really cool when you start to layer it over other footage. So yeah, last thing I would say just to play around with is you can play around with all those different things that I've mentioned, and just try out different designs, because you can get all sorts of different. You can even fake sort of like passing through clouds if you get the angles right. A lot of it is really to do with where you position this camera, just getting that right sort of angle. You can sometimes get it to seem like you're passing through a cloud. This thing is just a sphere, right? It's just a sphere. The beauty of using a sphere is that you sort of get, anywhere you move your camera, you sort of get a different sort of perspective. Look, if I pop the camera here, you can hit Control-0 to set your camera, and then that's even a good location. You may want to play around the focal length. You can get all sorts of different looks. That's like a rise and smoke look. If I pointed the camera like this looks now sort of like we're passing through. So I'm going to save this one, passing smoke. So yeah, just try some different things is what I'm trying to say. You get loads of different results, and it's really not hard as well. It's not like you have to bake different simulations. It's kind of just constantly running. That's sort of the beauty of this technique, along with the fact that it renders really quickly as well. So how do you get it rendered with transparency? So what you got to do, go over here to your Eevee render settings and scroll down, and under film, you need to change that to transparent. And now you're going to see the black background's disappeared. So now it's quite hard to see the smoke, because obviously it's a black and grey, it's sort of a grey checkerboard, but it is there. And go to our output properties. This part's quite important. When you're rendering with transparency, you need to make sure that the codec that you're rendering to supports an alpha channel. So if you're rendering to image sequences, you can use PNG, or there's a few more you can use. I think you can use TIFF and OpenEXR. But if you want to do it if you want to encode it to a video, you need to select FFmpeg video, and you'll see we haven't actually got RGBA here. That's because some codecs don't support alpha channels. Just like JPEG, you can't. You know how like you can't get transparency with a JPEG image? It's like that, but with video. So H.264 does not support alpha channels, and that's sort of like the go-to one for web delivery. So you actually need to either use AVI, or I prefer to use QuickTime, just because it integrates quite well with After Effects and Premiere Pro. So I tend to use QuickTime. Again, go to file format, FFmpeg, change the container to QuickTime, change the video codec to QT animation, and you want to make sure this RGBA option is selected. You're not going to see that till you've changed these settings, so make sure you go back to RGBA. You should be able to render this out with transparency. So I'm going to just save this. And again, you want to save it somewhere you can find it, and now all you got to do is hit render and render animation, and you're done. So yeah, there you have it. Smoke in Eevee without volumetrics, cutting down your render times significantly. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it saved you some time. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon if you find value in the content that I produce. Supporting me on Patreon grants you instant access to all Blender project files for my tutorials, and also other exclusive perks. So feel free to join on there if you fancy supporting me. Alternatively, you can find more of my work at devmotion.co.uk.